We all live our lives according to two different sets of rules. One is written down in law books, and the other, well, it's written in scripture. These two invisible blueprints are in this constant tension, shaping everything from who owns the ground beneath our feet to the very definition of who we are. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain and make them visible.
Seriously, think about it for a second. That deed you have, that key in your pocket, what gives it any real power? It seems like such a simple question, but the answer goes so deep, right into the heart of history, power, and what we choose to believe.
So what we've got are these two powerful systems, kind of running in parallel, but often pulling in totally opposite directions. You've got the world of law, think courts, gavels, government authority. And then you have the world of scripture, covenants, moral principles, divine authority. And it's the friction between these two that really defines so much of our world.
All right, so let's start with the most fundamental thing you can own, right? Land. Who has the ultimate claim to it? Well, the answer depends entirely on which of those two blueprints you happen to be reading from. And wow, this slide really gets to the heart of it. The scriptural view says land is a sacred trust. It's not something you own, it's something you have a duty to take care of, stewardship. But the legal framework? Totally different story. Under common law, your ownership is just a right that's granted to you by the power of the state. You get a piece of paper called a title. One is a moral responsibility, the other is a state-sanctioned claim.
And this idea, sovereignty, is everything in modern property law. It's the legal system's answer to the question, oh yeah, says who? Well, the government says so. It claims supreme power, and from that power, every other claim to ownership flows downward. It's a really powerful top-down structure.
So you have to wonder, how did the U.S. government manage to claim sovereignty over a continent that was, already home to hundreds of nations? The answer is really locked into place in 1823 with a huge Supreme Court case, Johnson v. McIntosh. It basically took a colonial-era argument and made it the law of the land.
Well, the logic the court used was pretty wild. Chief Justice John Marshall argued that the European discovery of America gave the U.S. government the ultimate title, the true ownership. Now, indigenous nations could occupy the land, sure, but they couldn't sell it to whomever they wanted because they didn't hold that true title. And with that one sentence, the federal government became the ultimate source for all property rights in the country.
Okay, and this brings us to a really fascinating, super powerful word that kind of unlocks this whole story: conversion. It's a word that has two completely different meanings, but when you put them side by side, they reveal exactly what happened.
So on one side, you've got the theological idea of conversion, a total change of heart, a spiritual thing, it's an internal transformation. But then on the other side, you've got the legal definition of conversion, and it's a tort, a civil wrong. It's basically an external act of taking. It means wrongfully exercising control over someone else's property, denying them their rights. One is about changing your soul, the other is about unlawfully changing who holds the stuff.
So if you use that legal definition as a lens, you can see how colonial powers basically performed a massive legal conversion. They took land that was held under one system, indigenous law and occupancy, and they forcefully transformed its legal status into something else entirely, property owned under the authority of a European king or government. It was a transfer of control that was framed as a perfectly lawful act.
But this wasn't the final word. Not by a long shot. The same court, with the very same Chief Justice, was about to revisit this whole idea. And the legal story was about to get a lot more complicated.
Get this, just 9 years after that first case, the same Chief Justice, John Marshall, totally muddies the waters. In Worcester v. Georgia, he describes Native nations as distinct, independent political communities that still had their original natural rights. This ruling acknowledged a kind of tribal sovereignty, and it created this deep legal tension with that earlier decision, a tension that lawyers and courts are still arguing about today.
And look, this legal tug-of-war wasn't just happening in the U.S. It was part of a much bigger story playing out all across the Americas. Different European empires were stamping their own legal blueprints onto the land, and in doing so, they were creating entirely different worlds.
Okay, so this table breaks it down really nicely. You had two totally clashing approaches. On one side, you have the English. Their system was all about common law, which is built on court decisions and precedent. This eventually led to the idea of private property, what we now call fee simple title. But the Spanish and Portuguese, they used civil law. Rules came straight from the king. In their colonies, the crown owned all the land, and you were just granted the right to use it. Two totally different foundations for a society.
Okay, so here's where it gets really personal. This power, The power to define what land is, well, it also gives you the power to define who a person is. The same legal and administrative machines that print out property titles also create labels for people.
Just look at the evolution of the word American right here from an 1828 dictionary. It's kind of mind-blowing. It starts out as a word for the indigenous peoples. Then, just a few decades later, it's being used to describe the children of European colonists. And today, it's a legal status, a box you check on a form. This shows you the sheer power of administrative systems to literally redefine identity over time.
So what you're seeing is that same exact clash we saw with land, but now it's about identity. On one hand, you have your legal identity, a label the state assigns you. Citizen, non-citizen, whatever. It's an administrative category, and the state can change it. But then you have this idea of a scriptural identity, something that's described as inherent, God-given, a truth about you that exists completely outside of any government file.
And really, that brings us right to the core of this whole thing, the law. It builds the house we all have to live in. It creates the structure, the rules, the property lines. Scripture, on the other hand, doesn't write those laws. It gives us a totally different lens to look at that house and ask, is this right? Is this structure just? And who, ultimately, is the real authority here?
So that leaves us with this one last pretty powerful question to think about. When the legal label estate slaps on you, the administrative identity, clashes with the identity you know deep down to be true, which one of those blueprints really holds the ultimate authority in your life? It's a question that echoes through history, through courtrooms, and right into our own lives.